Hello, welcome to 2.4 Resource Management. So this is the second part of Theme 2 where we start looking at the non-financial side. So we've done the finance side in 2.1, 2.2 and 2.3. In this section we look at the operations department within an organization. So how they manage production. And so we're going to look at a few topics here. We're going to look at production, productivity and efficiency. We're going to look at capacity utilization, stock control and then quality management. This is just a brief kind of overview, not huge levels of depth, but enough to give you a bit of a recap and hopefully help you with any revision as you're preparing for exams or mock exams or what have you. We're going to start with production, productivity and efficiency, and the key thing here is we need to make sure we understand the difference between the two key terms in that heading. Productivity is the quantity that we produce per input. So the idea here with productivity is it's about the quantity that we produce. Efficiency is about getting the most out of your resources. And so when we think about our production, businesses, of course, want to be both productive and efficient, but it is really important to understand the difference between the two. And I always tend to use a basketball analogy here. So as well as being a business teacher, I'm also a basketball coach. And so when I think about productivity versus efficiency, I always think about this as an example. So if we've got the two basketball players pictured on the screen there are Stephen Curry and Klay Thompson, probably the two greatest shooters in NBA history. And if we say that Stephen Curry on the left takes 30 shots and hits 14, and Klay Thompson takes 20 shots and hits 11, this really clearly shows the difference between productivity and efficiency. Who's been the most productive? Well, the most productive has been Stephen Curry because he's made 14 shots, and in terms of quantity, he's made more. Whereas Klay Thompson's been more efficient because he's hit a higher percentage of his shots. He's made less of them, but he's been more efficient. And businesses want both of these things, of course, but in certain times they'll want more of one than the other. So a business, for example, that has a deadline to meet or has customers they need to get products ready for, productivity might be the most important thing because they need to get the products out ready for consumers. Whereas in other circumstances, maybe efficiency might be more important. So knowing the difference between those two key terms is really important. After that, we need to have a think about the different methods of production. So we've got 4 methods of production. I'm just going to go through the definitions of these. We've got job, batch, sell, and flow. So job production is where we create a one-off product. So if you think, for example, I'm getting married in July, and so if we were getting a wedding cake, we're not actually getting a wedding cake. We're going to get a giant tower of Krispy Kreme donuts instead because we've been to loads of weddings and no one seems to eat the cake, to be honest. So we decided we'd do something different. I'm going off on a tangent there, but that is an example of job production because it's a one-off production of a product. And so that's quite often going to be done by maybe labor-intensive methods by a member of staff. Batch is where we make a small group of identical products. So the donuts that I mentioned that we'll be getting for our donut tower at our wedding, that will be coming in a batch. We'll buy a certain number of those. I think the plan is to get about 80 Krispy Kreme donuts. So they might make them in a batch of 12, 20. It depends on really how many they expect they're going to sell. Another example could be if you go to Greggs and you buy some sausage rolls. As a northerner, I love Greggs. They might make them in a batch. They don't want to make too many because if they make too many and they don't all sell, they might have some wasted goods there. But they'll make enough of a batch that they can hopefully, once they get close to selling that batch, then make another. Cell production is where production goes through individual stages, referred to as these cells. And so typically what you'll have is a group of members of staff who might have a certain division of labor. They might have a certain thing that they do in that process. And so, for example, manufacturing a car would go through a variety of different cells. Each member of staff would do their bit. They'd pass it on to the next stage, etc., etc. That allows for certainly production of really complex things, complex products such as a car, for example. It would be unrealistic to expect one member of staff to have all of the skills to create all of the different parts. And so by dividing it up into these different cells, you can give an employee one particular role. They can become very, very good at it. And then you're benefiting from everyone's expertise. And then the flow production, the final one, is continuous production. And we would use this if we knew we had a huge amount of demand. And so we could just continuously produce a product because we knew we were going to need that demand. These methods of production are done either by humans or machines. And so we also need to make sure we understand the difference between capital intensive or labor intensive. Capital intensive is where work is done by machine. Labor intensive is where work is done by humans. Obviously, of course, a lot of products are a bit of both. And in fact, actually, think about the methods of production. A lot of products are a bit of both as well. So for example, if you were, apparently I've got cake on the mind, but if you were making like a cake that could potentially be customized, you might make the cake itself in a batch. And then you might, if you've got several orders, you might then do a little bit of job production at the end to just customize them for each of the potential customers. So you could find that a product might actually be more than one of those methods of production. And of course, a product might involve both capital and labor means in terms of production. But obviously, capital intensive would be where it's more capital than human, and labor would be where it's more labor than machine. When we think about our production, we also need to think about how much of what we can produce we are producing. And that's what 2.4.2 goes through. It goes through capacity utilization. So this is the percentage of the max available output that is being produced. So before we go any further, we need to understand what it is that determines our maximum output. This is going to be determined by our resources. And our resources are going to be split into two categories. We've got our physical resources in terms of the space, the machinery that we've got. We've also got the human resources in terms of the members of staff we've got as well. Those things in collaboration will create what we have our maximum available output. That's the maximum that our business can produce. And if we're calculating the percentage of that we are actually producing, the calculation is going to be pretty straightforward. The calculation of capacity utilization is actual output divided by max output times by 100. And that gives us our capacity utilization percentage. Why is this important? Well, what this does is this allows us to reduce our unit costs. The higher our capacity utilization, the more units a business produces, and that allows our fixed costs that we talked about in 2.2 and a little bit in, 2.2 was where we talked about that. And that allows our fixed cost to be spread over more units, which reduces our unit costs. So capacity utilization is really important because it makes our unit costs go down, which means that a business is more profitable with each item that they sell. So this potentially increases our profit margins. It makes our business more efficient. First of all, it's worth saying we don't want our capacity utilization to be 100% because that puts us in a bit of a vulnerable position in case we have a sudden influx of orders. For example, we might potentially then end up letting down our customers, but we want it to be pretty high, providing we've got the demand to be able to sell those goods. How do we improve our capacity utilization, though, if we have a situation where we can't quite produce enough to meet the level of demand? Well, there's a few things that we potentially can do. We potentially could increase the workforce hours. We could offer overtime to our staff to get production a little bit higher to effectively stretch beyond our capacity. That's only going to be possible if we don't already produce 24/7. Some businesses do, of course. They might have night shift workers, etc. We might be able to outsource production to another company. Outsourcing, which is also mentioned in Theme 4, is where we pay another company or contract another company to do something for us. So we could outsource some of the production. Downside of that is there's potentially a little bit less control of quality, but if we need to do it, then we might need to do that. We might potentially also reduce maintenance time. So obviously our machinery, which is quite heavily involved in our output, is going to need maintenance. It's going to need repairing. Well, if we reduce our maintenance time, then in some respects we potentially could have more production time. There is, of course, a downside to that you could, by reducing the maintenance, affect the long-term longevity of the machinery you've got. So that kind of covers our capacity utilization. In terms of stock control, we need to be aware of our stock levels over time. And so this is what we call a stock control diagram. I'm going to go through some of the parts of this and annotate this as we go, just to explain how stock works within a business and then link it to some of the theories that involve stock. So our stock level would look like this. So over time, we use stock and then we reorder it, and then our stock level goes back up and then we use it again. It's never going to be quite as linear as this. This suggests, well, unless we have contracted sales, it's never going to be quite so straight where our sales drop at the exact same rate all the time. But this is just for the example of showing us these different parts of our stock control diagram and introducing some of the key terms. We've got our maximum stock level. And that is actually probably going to be determined by how much we can actually hold. So our storage availability, there's no point in having more stock than we can actually physically hold. We also have what we call our buffer stock level, which is our minimum stock level. And there's a reason we keep a buffer stock. The reason we keep a buffer stock is if we go too close to the bottom there, we might potentially risk running out of stock and then disappointing customers. Whereas if we have a buffer stock, in case of an emergency, we can dip into that buffer stock in order to be able to potentially sell some products to consumers if demand is high. We also have a reorder level. So at some point, we are going to have to recognize that we're running out of stock and we're going to have to place a new order for that stock to arrive. You can see there that yellow line, that yellow dotted line across that graph there, that shows our reorder level. So when stock reaches that point, that is when we would place the order. And then obviously we've got to understand it's not going to come straight away. So we would have a lead time, which is you can see this orange area here in between when we place the order and when the new stock arrives. You can see where the new stocks arrive because our stock jumps up from our buffer stock level to our max stock level. That lead time is how long it takes for the stock to arrive at our business. So that's generally the kind of gist of a stock control diagram. One of the key models within stock control is this concept of just-in-time stock management. And this is where, you aren't going to believe this, this is where we order stock just in time for when we need it. So we would only order materials when we know we're going to need them. The whole intention of this is it means that we don't have to have a huge amount of stock in storage, which can reduce our storage costs, and there's some other benefits as well. But we'd have to implement this over a period of time. And what this would involve us doing is something like this. So we would order less stock, but more frequently. So in this situation, we've just ordered half the amount of stock, but twice as frequently. So we can then therefore, and I haven't done this on the diagram, but you can kind of imagine this. Our max stock level doesn't need to be at that level anymore. Our max stock level can drop down to what is the reorder level. And that means that we can potentially use some of that storage space for repurposing. We can use that for selling space. But potentially could go even further. We might even find that if we're able to do this effectively, we can reduce our buffer stocks to a point where we don't really have much buffer stock at all. It reduces waste. It reduces, because we won't have materials that we don't need. It reduces our storage costs. But it does rely really heavily on our suppliers being able to provide those stock for us on a quicker turnaround. And so it takes a lot of time to put this system in place, but if it's put in place effectively, it can be really, really useful in terms of becoming more efficient. The other topic we need to be aware of in stock control is the concept of lean production. And this is linked to just in time because it's all about cutting waste. We want to try and cut out waste in terms of wasted time, in terms of wasted money, in terms of wasted materials, while not affecting our quality negatively. Any action to do that is considered what we call lean production. There's more to it than that, but as an introduction, that gives you a bit of an idea. The final topic in 2.4 is quality management. There are a number of different ways we can measure quality, and of course, one thing that's worth really making clear is quality is going to be different from product to product. What is quality for a jacket is different to what is quality for a car. So there are a few methods of managing quality. We're going to look at 4 in particular. We're going to look at the differences between these and the benefits of using them. The first is quality control. So this is where we, in our production cycle, check for the quality of the product at the end of the production process. So after we've made the product, we will then check that it's of a good quality before we send it off to be sold. And depending on the product, we might check every single one. For example, if it was a car, we check every single car. If it was a chocolate bar or something like that, we might only check every 50th. And if there's a problem with that one, we might then have a look through the rest of the system. There is a benefit to this. Of course, it doesn't take a huge amount of time because it's only being checked at the end. However, there is the chance that we might miss some faults. So an alternative approach could be to do quality assurance, which is where we check the quality of the output during the process. This takes a bit longer because obviously our members of staff need to check during the process, which is going to add time onto the production process. It also might require some level of training to make sure that our members of staff are skilled at being able to identify quality and potentially identify faults, but it potentially offers a better alternative to quality control because it's a little bit more in depth and you can identify the problems earlier, whereas with quality control, you might have a process that takes 5 hours and the error might have happened in the first hour, and because you don't identify it until the very end, you just wasted 4 hours and potentially some materials you might not be able to salvage, whereas with quality assurance you should pick those things up a little bit quicker. Another model is total quality management, and this is just where the whole concept of managing quality is part of the culture of the organization. It's embedded in the business to try and make sure quality of the output is of a really high standard. And this requires probably some training as well. It requires the employees to buy in to the fact that quality is really, really important. And linked to that in a similar kind of vein is Kaizen. Kaizen just stands for continuous improvement. I'm not one of those types who's kind of got like a live, laugh, love poster in my house or anything like that. I'm not really a big slogan guy. I don't have any like tattoos with kind of meaningful things. said, but if I was to say that there's anything I kind of like to live by as a kind of ideology, if there's anything I've taken from being a business teacher for 10 years, it's this concept of continuous improvement. It's always looking to make a 1 or 2% improvement in your your work, so that you're always getting better. You could argue that putting these videos together is me trying to be a little bit more Kaizen. I'm just trying to find different ways to provide resources for my students to be able to revise. And so that kind of concept of Kaizen, continuous improvement, again, is similar to total quality management in the fact that it's built into the culture. It's kind of like you have Kaizen businesses where their objective is to just try and always find different ways to improve. And those improvements could come from anyone within the organization. There's the freedom there to share ideas that potentially could help improve the business. So hopefully that covers 2.4 resource management. If you've got any questions, please chuck them down in the comments. And we'll see you in the final video in this Theme 2 series, which will be 2.5.